Paul's letter to the Colossians is on the heels of some discussion we don't know about. The Colossian heresy is what it's called, and there are around 40 different explanations of it because it is not quite clear, as it is in Galatians, what Paul is addressing directly. But whatever the empty philosophers or vain teachers around Colossae were saying, we learn things about Christ that we would not know or would not know as clearly without Paul's letter to the Colossians. In verse 15, he says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation," which sounds like a heresy in and of itself if that's all he said, because Jesus was not a created being. Then Paul goes on to say, "For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of the cross." Which is broad, rich theology about the second person of the Trinity, about Christ's humanity and divinity wrapped into one. And then he makes it very real to the Colossians in verse 22. "And you, who once were alienated and hostile, doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister." Paul then describes his own call to ministry and his own gift set and some of the circumstances going on right now and what just happened to him in Laodicea. And then he says, "Therefore, as you received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him," echoing language that Paul often uses. If Christ did this, then we're in him and we respond to that. "Rooted and built up in him and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving." And now he gets to the heresy a little more directly in verse 8 of chapter 2. "See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ." Herein, Paul is likening the teachings of the heretics to either the earth, air, fire, and water, or demonic spirits. There's debate about that. I think the earth, air, fire, and water probably has a little bit more going for it, but Paul is saying these teachings that look Christian are just as evil as teaching that the earth is, or that the world is only made up of earth, air, fire, and water. "For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have been filled in him, who is the head of all rule and authority. In him also you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God, who raised him from the dead. And you who were dead in your trespasses, God made alive together, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him." Then he talks about guarding one another's conscience, similar to Romans 14. And then he reminds them that they have been given a new self that they are to put on. In chapter 3, "If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above. Set your mind on things that are above, for you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory." Paul goes on to give a vice list and a virtue list, remind people to act like Christians in their homes and places of business. And then he says, "Continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. Walk in wisdom towards outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer each person. Grace be with you. Whatever the Colossian heresy was, we're grateful for it, because in about a 15-minute read, Paul teaches us about the preeminence of Jesus Christ, and that in him the fullness of deity dwells. Be encouraged, friends.